Hi everyone. In this particular demo we're going to be using layer masks. Now when you apply a mask to any given layer, that gives you the opportunity to make non-destructive changes, which is very important in itself. What I mean by that is some of the filters, some of the different changes you may make to any given layer or object may be permanent. So if you want to reverse out of that, you may have to keep a backup copied layer of that before you make your change, so you could go back to it before that change. Now with a layer mask, you can make all those changes. In fact, you can even change your change if you need to. But most importantly, when it comes to making changes, if it's a subtle change, you could disable the mask and then make a before and after comparison just to see how much of a difference your subtle change will make. It may make all the difference in the world. It may hardly make any change at all. It gives you the option. Now again, layer masks are just another tool that will actually help you paint along the way, but what it will do is give you the opportunity to make adjustments and changes along the way. Now, in traditional watercolors, usually you have to protect a lighter colored area and or object in your painting. Misk it, frisk it, whatever the case may be, to protect that area of the white of the paper so you could go back and make very subtle value changes to that area while doing a spontaneous wash of darker colors and water around it. This gives you the opportunity to still paint in a carefree way but protect your lighter values of the paper. Now in digital, it's roughly the same way. You could still mask out an area and protect it and then go back over it if you want to work in a traditional way. Because keep in mind, this is digital. The options are endless, and whether it be oils, acrylics, or watercolors, doesn't really matter. I'll let you answer that one. But what does matter is if you use a mask in digital, it gives you the opportunities to make changes along the way. Now, if you use traditional colors the way you were meant to in digital, then that means you could work from light to dark with usually no return. Once you start building up darker colors, then if you try to put a lighter color back over it, then that might be considered a mixed media, which is no longer a traditional watercolor. However, with a mask, you could indirectly use lighter colors over dark by putting a layer of lighter colors down first, then a layer of darker colors over top of it, and then masking out those darker colors to reveal the lighter colors underneath. This gives you the opportunity to work with what I would consider the positive shapes. And what I mean by that is, say for example, you want highlights, or if you want to define specific leaves, grass on trees, shrubs, brush, anything that you're trying to do, then what you could do is put a layer of darker colors over those lighter colors and then mask off those darker colors to reveal a positive shape of leaves that are highlighted and lighter in value than the colors around them. What this does is give you the opportunity to work with positives, which is a lot easier sometimes, that especially if there's a limited amount of positives. So in other words, it's one thing to put a whole bunch of black splashes on a rock, what we will be doing, but it's another thing that if you need light splashes, what we could do is either just put a little bit of dark splashes down or a little bit of light splashes down on a mask. We'll go over all of these different options in this particular demo, but first we're going to design a brush that will help us with this particular painting. We're going to do that from start to finish. And then we're also going to go over just how we can actually paint on the mask itself. You could use variations from white to black with any values of gray in between, but you could also use solid colors, yellows, blues, reds, oranges, whatever color you want. And what that will do is give you a very specific amount of change if you want to evenly change a specific area. Because working with 100% colors is quite different than working with a very small percentage of a black. You may get overlap marks. Now keep in mind, a lot of this relies on what type of brush you're using. pressure sensitivity, how you have the shape set up, everything. So what that will do is give you a different result, possibly, in your mask. Now let's get started. We got a lot to go over. Let's dive in and see how we could just use a mask to benefit our style of painting. Okay, let's take a look and see how layer masks can help us in any given painting, no matter what we're doing, that we can make non-destructive changes without making it permanent or being able to go back over and even readjust the changes we already made. Now, I set this up just to show you a rough idea of your choice between using values of grays or even just using solid colors. If you want to make a very specific amount of change and keep it consistent, then you could use an actual solid color. You don't have to use values of grays. The reason why is if I hit the letter G on my keyboard, it will turn this into a grayscale, and now you'll see that this is the lemon, this is the orange, this is cobalt blue, and it's even coming out a little wee bit lighter than my burnt sienna, then my Prussian blue, and then of course black. Now here is the black, here's the different values, but now we could also see that because I'm not using the actual pure colors over here of 100%, I'm getting overlap marks if I used a straight edge brush. So depending on what type of brush you're using, the pressure sensitivity, it might be a little bit more difficult to fine tune your end result on the mask if you use values of grays. Whereas if you use just a solid color, I'm getting a pure set amount of change, and then I could go back to that same change without worrying about pen pressure, brush settings, anything. So let's take a look at this. Now, if I'll center this up, I'll hit the G again, take us back to color. Now, if I try to duplicate these over here, I will go back to my watercolor brush. First, we'll put it on 2. And again, this is going to depend on how I have my brush settings, sensitivity. If I push hard or soft, depending on the opacity, that's going to make a big difference. Now, what I will do is go back to this right here. Oh, and just for example, if you want to add a mask on a layer, all I have to do is select that layer, right click, add layer mask, and that's it. As soon as you add it, it will be selected, ready to go. So now I will click back on this one, and then just to disable that mask to show you what these actual paintbrush strokes are doing, I will actually disable it. It says use layer mask. I will click that, and that's it. Now what that's doing is putting my blue and purple layer right back to where it was. So nothing has changed other than what the mask is doing. Now if I actually right click that and then click use layer mask, then I will go back to what the mask is actually doing. Now if I want to duplicate these different changes here, then if I put it on 2, I select black and then just pull down. That's it right there. That's what I am doing. And you can even see where I backed up a little bit, I got that white mark. If I change it to 5, and that's 5, and then just take it down, that's already the same thing as far as making some change, but it's already changing quite a bit as soon as I go to 10. That's 10. There's quite a bit of a difference there. If I go to 50, then I'm already just about back to pure white paper. And also, obviously 100 will and should be the pure white paper. Now here's the thing. If I go over to this side and leave it on 100, I'm already on my black. Then if I duplicate this one, I'm definitely going to get that. That is just a pure white paper, and that's it. But now if I go to my Prussian blue and use it the way it is, if I press down hard, I don't have to worry about pressure or anything. It's going to duplicate that masking amount exactly. Then the same thing with burnt sienna, and then cobalt blue, and then cadmium orange, and then the cadmium lemon. So in other words, if I want to take, just say for example, distant trees, and I made them too dark and they're coming forward a little bit, I want to push them back and lighten them up. Then if I want to lighten a specific plane of trees all down the same amount, I could go to a specific color and use that color to take all those trees in that same plane down the same amount. Now, if they're in fog and their values vary, well, then that's different. You could adjust them any way you want. That will be a demo coming up soon. But now what we'll do here is we're going to show you how this can actually work on a real painting in an interesting kind of way. What we're going to do is work with this brownish blue gray gob down here, and we're going to turn it into a little clump of grass with depth. That's what I want to do in my paintings, create depth. And to do that, we're going to use a layer mask. Let's do that next. Okay, let's create our grass and see how we could do this. Now, what I will do is go to this. I'll leave this on, but now what I'm doing is, there's my blue layer and my purples. I turned it off. That's to let you know. But then now, if I put my oranges and yellows up, that's the layer that will be underneath the blue layer. And I put this tuft of dark grays, dark browns and blues on top of the blue layer. And this is what we're going to work with. So now what we could do is actually go back to the same masking layer and work on it that I just made these color changes. And if I go to, just say for example, we'll use this brush right here, but we're going to take it way down about there. And then I can even change the opacity, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually work on this mask right here. But then what I will do is pick out lemon first. And if I pick the lemon, I'm right here on it already. If I start making grasses, what I'm trying to do is make the grasses that are way back in the shadows, that they're going to vary, but they're going to be barely noticeable because they're back in the shadows, and that's what will help me create depth. So if I start taking these over this way, this is what will actually start to create my grasses. And then I can even take some down a little bit, keep them all working this way. And what I'm doing is try to building grass layers around this real dark shape that would consider to be the deepest shadowed area of this clump of grass. And this gives me the opportunity that what I'm actually doing is I'm actually erasing the blue and purple layer to reveal this layer underneath. By doing that, if I use my lemon to start off with, what I could do is create layers of grass coming at me that will be more and more intense lemony orange than just by doing the shades of gray. This will give me the opportunity that, keep in mind, if I start off with my lemon, I could also change the opacity of it. So that way they won't look like they're all in a perfect line, all the exact same value, and then create another perfect line of grass. What it's doing is it's giving me the opportunity to stagger that layer, then create another layer, stagger that layer, create another layer, and stagger that layer. This way it's giving me the opportunity to create excellent depth of just a typical clump of grass. Now if I move to, just say for example, cobalt blue, which is right there, and then go back over these, and that one, I'll make the bend a little bit sharper. And now what it'll do is the first layer of lemon yellow masking I did is going to push those back to the point where you can barely see them. And if I just make some bends here and there just to give a little bit of action. But now if I go to the next one, just say for example Prussian blue, which is right there, now I'm even going to get a more intense yellowish orange blade of grass. And now you could see that the first ones I put down, you could barely see them. They're pushed back so far that you're getting the hint of grass, but it's just creating depth of this clump of grass. And then if I want to create even a grass effect right here in front of this and then chop off the bottom of that darker area, I could do that if I want to. And then now if I go to my pure black, those would be without a doubt the brightest, lightest colors of grass. And there we have our basic clump of grass. But now keep in mind, here's the last thing I want to show you with a layer masking used for such as this. And that is if I go back to my orange and yellow layer, I could still paint on it while the mask is there, and the mask will still protect that blued area. That what I could do then is, say for example, now all I have is solid yellowish orange grass. But say for example, if these are in mud or anything along those lines, then the bottom root areas might be darker. So what I could do then is go back to my orange and yellow area layer, take out my burnt siennas, and let's go with the bloom wet, and we will turn it down a little bit, take it up a little bit, and then I could go back in and paint my burnt sienna areas where I want them on the grass. And my darker bluish brown areas of the deep grays will hide over those lighter values of the burnt siennas and any other color I choose to use down here to start to actually change the values of my grass. Take a little bit of raw umber in there. And then keep in mind, I could have done that to also every layer of grass I built up to slowly lighten up or darken up whatever I want to do of the grasses that I'm building with that mask. Now, here's my clump of grass, but if I turn off that mask, right back to square one. Now, with that in mind, there is an excellent way to make changes for your artwork in a non-destructive way. Now, hopefully this will give you a rough idea how we're going to do this, but first we're going to take a look at some brushes that I designed for this particular demo, but there is a very distinct difference of how I'm going to use these for a mask versus just a regular brush. Let's take a look at these and see what we could do with these types of brushes using them on a mask. Let's take a look. Okay, let's go ahead and see how we're going to design this brush. There's a couple of things that we could think about, even making a simple brush like this. Now, this brush could be just for this type of painting or paintings of any pine trees, but especially this kind of pine tree. But now this is our photo. I'm going to zoom in and I want to just show you. This is the branch I'm going to be working with right here. And it's also kind of like oval shaped, pointy, almost like a football, if you will. And the reason why is because then I could use that on either side of the tree. That if I use a branch like this over here, then I would have to flop that brush and create another one to be able to use it on the left-hand side of the tree. What I want to do is I'm going to first take it back, and then I will actually go to my transform tool, and we're going to make this a lot bigger. Now, again, since we're going to use this one here, I just want to make like an oval shape so I could use it either side and not be a specific side of a tree. And I'm going to make this much bigger. And I'm holding the shift key down just so nothing gets distorted. And I'll just put it right there. And we'll go back to the transform tool one last time and move it towards the center here a little bit. And this is the branch we're going to be working with. And again, now I'll go to my pine branch image. And what I'm going to do, now again, with this particular type of brush, you may want your brush stamp, so to speak, to vary in values. So in other words, I may not want to make it pure black the whole way through, because then it's only going to stamp that solid color and that's it. Now we could adjust that to a certain extent with grains, but sometimes it's even better to just start with a varied image as far as values go. So then what that means is I will go to my watercolor brush, and I am going to pick this one right here, my just detailed script brush, and I'm going to leave the opacity around half, 50. And then that way I could go back over it a couple of times if I want to make certain areas darker. But what I will do is I'm going to go even a little bit closer so you can see what I'm doing. And we're just going to retrace this brush out real quick. Branch, I should say. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this script rough. It has like a jagged edge to it. I think that would be far better for a pine tree branch, actually. But we're going to take it down in size a little bit, and then we're going to take the opacity down. And this would only make sense a little bit more as far as what we could do. And then I'm just going to trace it out. And we'll do this in real time, so please bear with me. And what I want to do is just I want a lot of daylight here, just different places of where different branches might be, different things going on. And I'll leave it at the same size of the brush I'm using now to trace it, only because to fine tune these kind of things, I may have to go back, and what I do is I keep all my stamp designs handy. So that way, if I want to go back to them and make them smaller or larger, I can, because depending on when I'm working with it, it may be too big or too small when I start adjusting the size of the brushes. So if I start taking the brush down too much in size, then the details of the pine needle branches may completely disappear. And that is not something I want. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just going back over this. Again, this is only about 50%. And I'm just going back over here and there. And just to make it irregular. Now this right here, I may not even want to. In fact, I'm already short. Well, yeah, we'll leave it there. But what I'm going to do is just make it a little wee bit different in here. Only because when I'm designing a brush like this, for lack of better words, I really don't want any part of the brush to really jump out at you. In other words, like a perfect triangular shape or a perfect circle, anything like that, that when you start using that brush over and over and over, if that eye-grabbing shape keeps grabbing your eye every time you use the brush, then it will look too repetitious, too stamped, and not random enough for a nature painting. So what I will do is go down in here, and then this is where I will taper it in to the trunk. So then this way I could use it for either side. Now keep in mind, even with a brush such as this, I could flop it and already make it a completely different brush. Or we could do even different things as far as taking that same brush, flopping this image, and stacking it on top of this image as it is, and that would even create a different brush by having two different shapes, one on top of each other. Now that's not bad there. We'll leave it go at that, and we'll see how this works. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the opacity all the way up and just go back over some of these areas and just make them a little wee bit darker, especially where I think there might be shadowed areas to begin with. Some of the edges of the pine branches might be lighter in value compared to some of the more deeper recessed areas of this small branch. And we'll see how this works first, and then we could fine tune it from there. But again, this would be a good way for you to make a custom brush no matter what you're painting, because there are quite a few steps involved in creating a brush such as this. So it's just not a smear brush. It's going to have to stamp this image certain spaces, certain ways, and we'll adjust the angle, we'll adjust the jitter of the angles, the spacing, the opacity, all those things. Okay, right there, I think that's it. Then what I will do is I'll go back to my mouse actually, and then I'll turn the photo off and we'll see what we got. And now what we'll do is we'll even fine tune it a little bit. And what I want to do is make some softer areas, and I'll even go back to a blend brush and just kill some of those hard straight edges that are within that branch. So you have just some soft, subtle transitions from one value to another. And again, as much time as we're spending on this, it could actually speed up our time quite a bit when we go to make that pine tree painting. Okay, we could try that. Now I'll zoom back out. And then we're going to isolate this shape, and let's see what we could do with it. Okay, now let's see what we could do with that shape. Now we went ahead and covered the pine tree branch with different values of black to give us a pine tree branch simulation. Now let's see what we could do with it. Now the best thing we could do is to try and find a brush out of the default brushes that best does what we already want a new brush to do. And that would be, this one would be one pretty close. And I picked it out. I have it right here ready for us, and it's a fan 2. Now remember, please, I have the Wacom, the brush 2, which is kind of pretty sensitive to a lot of different things. So if you can't follow along exactly because of the equipment you have, that's no problem. We're going to do a couple of workarounds here as soon as we get this done, so you could try and do something that will best fit your equipment also. Now let's run through this one first. Now I picked the fan brush, and what I'll do is, if we look at our horizontal line, it's giving me this shape. Now if I actually take the horizontal line and go this way, it's giving me that shape. Now if I hold the horizontal line vertical, it's giving me this shape. But then if I hold the horizontal line this way, it's giving me that shape. So depending on how I'm holding my brush and which way I'm dragging it, depending on how I'm holding it, is going to give me a different pattern. I'll turn down the water completely just so we don't have no water issues while we're doing this. But now, what I want to do then is actually open up my brush creator. That's just right here, window. That would be right here, brush creator, or just F5 for shortcut. And then what we'll do is we are going to first start off with the shape and the grain. And what I want to do is actually go to my select tool, and I'm going to make a nice square selection around this. I'm holding the shift key as I select. And what I normally like to do with these types of shapes, just to get the maximum use of the shape itself, is I usually have a fairly tight edge around my actual brush stroke itself. So I will select that, and we'll center it up a little bit. That don't look too bad right there. And then now that it's set, what I'll do, these are just fog shapes I previously made. What I could do then is just hit import selection, and there it is right there. Now, to try it with this brush, it already gave that new fan brush the new shape. And now what I want to do is I will deselect so I could paint anywhere. And we'll just stay on this layer. And I will actually grab a dark green just to start off with. And that way we could see what it's going to do. Now it's doing the exact opposite of what I want it to do. So in other words, if I want, I'll go by the line, and it's also still giving me my old pattern. So number one, I have to get rid of the old pattern. I have this brush shape selected. If I go to the next one, there's my fan brush shape. I don't want it anymore. So I'm going to get rid of it completely. So now I only have my pine brush shape, but what it's doing is it's really stacking up the pictures, the brush stamp itself, a lot. So I got to change some things here. What I want to do change first is spacing. The angle is okay. It's at 90. That's okay. Angle jitter, we're going to give it just a little bit. We'll start off at 10. And that way, in other words, when the branch, instead of all of them being perfectly straight, then some of them will be this way, some will be this way, some will be that way as I stamp, and that's what I want. Randomness for nature. Now we'll go to the stroke. We'll leave these here right there where they are for now. And then the maximum size I'm definitely going to take all the way up to 700. Every brush I use, I make it as big as I possibly can. That's just me, because we're going to be doing this demo at a 16 by 20 at 300 DPI. So that's a little bit on bigger. But then now size jitter, I'm going to take it all the way up to at least 40 or maybe even possibly 50. We'll try it first. We'll just leave it right there at 40. And then pen pressure, I'll just, you can see what it's going to do up here as far as whether we take the pressure down or not. And if I take it all the way up, then what I'll do is I want it right now that looks better for me, because the reason why is it will also be subjected to the size versus pressure a lot more. So in other words, if I press real light, I'll get a small branch. If I press heavy, I will get a thicker, bigger branch. And that's what I want to be able to do. Now I'm going to take the opacity all the way up. That will give me the most opacity I want, because I want to be able to control the opacity from over here. That way, if I want a lighter branch, I'll make it lighter over here. But I want all the paint I can, since this is going to be a specific type of stamp. I'll leave the opacity all the way up here, but then the opacity jitter, we could adjust that. We'll start off with, just say, for example, 30 right there, and then I'll leave the pen pressure there. Now spacing, let's see what we get now. We need a lot more spacing. It's stacking up too many branch pictures at the same time. So let's go all the way up to 40. We can even see what it's doing up here. Now let's start at 50 actually. And then spacing jitter, I'll take up to maybe, just start with 15. That way there won't be an exact same amount of space in between me either. I want them to bounce around and be as random as possible. Scatter, we got to be careful with this particular brush with scatter. Reason why is if it starts scattering them all over the place, left or right of your brush stroke, then you may be starting to put shapes down where you don't want to, or you can't control where they go as much as you want to. So I'm going to keep the scatter. We'll try it at 15 at first. That's good right there. Oh, I better type it in. Yeah, I'll type it in. Okay, that's 15 there. No smudge. And then now you can see if I push real light, I'm getting a real fine branch. Now if I push heavier, it's actually giving me a much bigger one. But then also I think I could take the actual, let's see, pressure, 10 tilt. No, that's not bad. I think the size jitter is a little bit too much. I'm going to take it back down to 30. That's a little bit better. So now if I use this green, let's just say for example over here, if I want to do the left side or the right side of the tree, now where the pine tree is, the bigger the pine trees are, the more they have a wider variety of branches. In other words, at the top, they may be up more. As the branches get bigger and bigger, then they start to level off just because of the weight of the branch. So in other words, if I'm doing a pine tree here, this is what I could do. And this is only, just say for example, the left side. I think the size jitter is up still a little bit too much. I'll put it back down to 20. And then now as I get close to the top of my tree, whatever size it's going to be, then I could start actually tilting them upright more to where they're perfectly straight up and down. And then if I come down to the right side, then it would be the exact opposite. Oh, that's a little bit too big. And let's actually do this. Take the size down a little bit, just to start off with. And then now I can make it bigger. I think you get the point now of what I would be up to. But then I could still put down, nope, don't like that one. And then keep in mind, some of these then we could even put in front, even like this, just level. And that would be actually a branch coming right at you. Some branches grow to the left, some branches grow to the right, but there are branches that grow directly away from you and directly at you. So we got to put those in too. And that would be these right here. But then keep in mind, I think what I would do is actually start off with a lighter green and then go to darker colors as I went on with the brush, I should say, as I went on with the tree. Because keep in mind, we could also use a transparent lock and then lock a lighter color to start with, and then go even over with different brushes and go back in and just shade the specific areas that we want and make those specific areas darker, because that's what we're going to be doing with painting this demo. But then also more importantly, then we're going to be reversing that with the layers. Now you could see how we got started with the typical pine tree branch brush and how it's going to work for us. And then also, if I change colors, just say for example, if I go to this turquoise, cobalt turquoise dark, and if I actually take the opacity down, make the brush smaller, I could then start making distant trees in the background. And what I would also do for those trees, because that's what we're going to have to do in this particular demo, I would also put water to it, and then when I lighten them up, then that way the water will diffuse the detail and the contrast. This one in the foreground, I could put a lot more contrast in it because it's going to be closer to us, so we would need more detail and more contrast. The background trees will be lighter, less contrast, less detail. So we could keep those in mind as we're doing this. But what we're going to do next, now that we have our brush planned, now first thing we got to do is, what we'll do is then, now you could either make this as a separate brush. So what I would do is then save as a new brush preset. Now I got those same brushes side by side. One of them was the original fan. This one is now our new brush with the new settings. So what I want to do with this one is save that as the new default. Save changes as new default. So now this will go off our reset button. But then if I click on the old brush and click on that, it'll go back to our fan brush. So now we still have our fan brush, but now we have a completely new design brush that we're going to work with for this demo. But first, let's go into the photograph we're going to be working with and just try to devise some kind of a game plan for this next watercolor demo. Okay, here's the photograph we're going to be working from. This particular photograph, I stretched it out a little bit since we're just going to roughly trace it and then just use it as a reference. Stretching out the photo is no big deal because we're going to be freehanding everything after that anyway. And like I always say, when you're painting, you're just drawing with color. Now what we're going to do here is I added a little bit to the sky area. This was more of a 2:3 format of the photograph, but I'm putting it on a 20 by 16, which is a 4:5 format, which is a little bit more squarish, if you will. Now what I'm going to do with this particular photograph, you could see some of the pine trees. That's where we'll use our pine tree branch brush. And what I also did was I went ahead and made some blueberry brushes just for these down in here. So what we'll do is we'll mask off all the rocks to keep them lighter value. Then that way I could go ahead to town and just start splashing greens and yellows and the darker greens, even maybe a little bit of blues here and there, and just to make it just like a classic watercolor, mix up the colors a little bit. But what I will do then is be able to protect the lighter colors of the rocks and paint around them, and then reverse that selected area and then just paint the rocks. But what we will also do is we're going to be working with two positive areas, two different ways. I'm going to use the branch brush, pine tree branch brush, to make the pine trees. That is pretty much considered a positive area. It's just the darks over the lights, and it is our subjects. But then I'm also going to make the blueberries in a positive way. But what we'll do is we'll lay down all our greens, yellows, maybe a quinacridone gold, which is this right here, down here, and a couple other different colors that just vary the colors a little bit and let them mix a little while. But then what we'll do is we'll layer over a good bit darker colors over those in given places, but we'll help ourselves out to start block things in. But then what we could do is refine our edges with our mask. They work in a grayscale, but consider other colors, and I'll show you why. Let's do that next. Okay, remember, just as a quick review, because the masks will even work on a photograph. Now what I'll do is I'll turn off my drawing, and I will go and right click on my photograph, add layer mask, and then I'll come over here. I'll just use this real sharp edge script brush. Start off with yellow, 100%, as big as the brush could go. That's all that it'll mask. If I go in the same sequence of colors I used in the actual mask demo, I'll go to orange next. That's how much it will mask. I will go to cobalt blue. That's how much it will mask. Burnt sienna. That's how much it will mask. Prussian blue. It's almost gone. Pure black. It's gone. So now the only thing that you see now is just the white of the paper. That layer is completely gone. If I turn off my mask, everything is right back to where it is. So again, if I start painting some of these pine trees back in here and some of them are too light, too dark, especially if they're too dark, then I could go back in with my mask and lighten them up. Now, if they're too light, then I could do a couple of things there. I could just duplicate that tree back over again and just copy paste it, or a couple of things to do different things if you want to make it a little bit darker, or you can even lock a transparent lock and go back over it and shade it a little bit darker. That's why I like these kinds of objects on their own layer, so I could go back in and rearrange them and change them once I start seeing the entire painting come together, because I'm just used to using traditional watercolors in a traditional watercolor way. So I like to keep my options open till the very end. And especially since this is digital painting, take advantage of digital options. Let's get this painting started. I'm going to go into speed painting, and then we'll stop a little over halfway and talk about what we've done so far. Let's get started. I did not bother showing the tracing of the drawing itself. I just started with the drawing. Now I'm working in my clear water areas that I will use to lock the transparency to make my mask for the boulders. They will be reasonably lighter than everything around them. Working in the sky and some close-up clouds. The fog rolling in, I will also change those. Here I'm working on the quinacridone golds, yellows, and light greens of the first layer. Now the distant pine trees, working in with them some texture. I could always go back in and change some of these things with a mask if I need to. Now, I actually selected a wrong area, this area right here, and I am changing it out, and I feathered it back in and created a bush of azaleas instead of a boulder that I thought it was. Now, I could have used my clone tool, but that's not until after everything is complete and all flattened. This was at the very end of controlling the paint, and I will put that link up now. Creating the second layer of the blueberries and azaleas, everything is going to be much darker, because remember, we are actually going to be masking off the second layer to reveal what's underneath to the first layer. Here I'm doing the same thing with the pine trees. All that I did was create a first layer of pines, duplicate that layer, and then darken the second layer so the two layers match perfectly. And then I will go back and mask off the second layer to reveal the underneath. Let's take a look and see what we have. Okay, let's take a look and see what we have. Well, first thing I want to do is actually go over the brush shapes just one last time, because I added a few things. And that would be this right here. And I'm going to open this up bigger just so we can see it. Now, here's what I did. I created some of the blueberry brushes we're going to use. Now, here's the original pine brush we made right here, the pine tree branch brush. Now, what I did was I took it and duplicated over that layer and made this one. All I did was spun it around, rotated it, and then I added a third one to this. Now, each time I may have erased a little bit of the second one and the third one added, but then I also rotated them just to get a unique shape, unlike any of the other ones that I've already made. This way, if I decide to use more than one brush, then I won't get too much of a duplicated shape that might be recognizable throughout my tree. Now, here's the big thing I want to show you. This is my original blueberry brush, but then what I did was I just took it, duplicated it over again, spun it around a little bit, and added it right here, and then made this brush, and then added again the same shape to this one and got this, and then added a fourth one and got this one. So what I wanted to do was create just like shapes of the top of a blueberry bush, and that was it. And it didn't take very long at all. But remember, the bigger my brush gets as far as width goes, the smaller the leaves will appear on the picture. So I want to be able to make sure I also could keep my leaves in proportion as they come closer, because this is a 20 by 16 at 300 dpi. So in other words, a 700 pixel brush will only take me so far. Now with that in mind, here's one thing I also wanted to show you. Very important. This type of brush, I took these same shapes here and blended down the bottoms to transparent. And the reason why is when we start stamping over our dark colored layer, then that will gradate down into the dark colored shape and area that I want under that highlighted area. So I will instantly get a hard highlighted edge from the layer underneath that will gradate down into the shadows of that highlighted shape. This way I could just start stamping and it will give me different areas of what I'm looking for right away. And then I could control those light and dark areas by either making them darker or even lighten them up. And I'll show you what I mean right now. We'll get rid of this guy. And then now, just say for example, here's what I have when it comes to my 2 pine trees. This is the darker layer for this one. And then this is a lighter one. If I turn this one off, now my pine tree's gone completely. So by turning this one on, this is the lighter values that I'm going to mask down to. So if I put a mask on this layer right here, and I will show you, I'll just add the layer mask. Now it's on, and I will enlarge this a little bit. And then what I will do is go to watercolors, and I will go down to one of these. Let's try the middle right here, this one. This one kind of looks like it would be a branch coming right at you. So in other words, it looks like it's curling up a little bit towards the center. Now if I put this down, this is working on the mask. Now if, say for example, I grab about a medium value color, which would be about the cobalt blue or the burnt sienna, as according to our demo. I'll turn it all the way up just to get us started. And I could turn the size down just a shade, and we'll put it up a little bit. And I don't need any water for the mask, obviously. And what I'll do is make a shape right there, and that's what it would look like. Now, keep in mind, I did not fade out the bottom of my branches, so I could either leave it like that, fade them out as a mask in the actual brush itself, or I could also then just go back to, just say for example, my bloom wet, and start going back to lighter values, which would be my whites, my unbleached titanium, my yellows, and then maybe even the quinacridone gold. But we'll try the unbleached white, which is right there. And I'll turn up just a little bit, turn that down a little bit. But then if I start, up too much. If I start going back over the bottom of what I just stamped, I will actually start taking it back to my darker values of the second layer. So in other words, I could keep on doing this back and forth with my lights and darks of colors on my mask till I get the end result I want. But what I did was I created a lighter colored shape on top of a dark background. So if I want to create depth in an object, or more importantly, just intensify the shape or complexity of it, then I could create lighter colored shapes on a dark background. Now, again, the same thing, and this is one last thing I want to show you before we finish off this painting, and that is if I go down here into this area here and use my blueberry brush, let's just grab this one right here, and I will leave it on, let's go with cobalt blue. And now what we have to do is find this layer here, which is this layer right here. That is the base layer, and then here is the dark layer. Now if I go to that one, And what I'll do is if I turn this off and mask this, now this is the layer I'll end up showing. This is what I'm going to reveal to. So if I turn this one back on, I'm working on the mask. Now if I use my blueberry brush that I designed with the faded bottom and cobalt blue, this is what I will get. Now what happens is I get a nice hard crisp top edge of leaves, and then what I can actually do is fade that down to the shaded areas, and depending on how I overlap these is which I'm going to do, then I could either vary the size, vary the position. That is what I'll do, and every now and then I will back up and redo a shape, because remember I have the brush itself staggered in shape, value, opacity, so sometimes I may not get the exact effect I want or the exact branch position I want, then I could just undo it. But now that I have this down, if I turn it sideways, I'll get branches going around the side of the tree like this, and put a couple more in here, and depending on how I overlap them, here's what I wanted to show you. Now all I have to do is go back to the working area of that layer, which is this layer right here, this part of the thumbnail itself, and then I can even go back in and add more dark colors to it, and that would be, just say, for example, let's go with the bloom, and if I want to put some more browns in here, I could go back to my sepia, no water, don't need any water for this, unless you want to, obviously. But if I take it up now, if I go back in here, I could go back in and add browns, different places, if I need more browns, if I have too much greens, or if I want to vary them. But then also keep in mind, while these areas are masked off, you could even go further and go back to the layer below it and then add colors to that. So if I want to go back and add more golds, or just say, for example, let's say, let's go with golds or oranges. I'll go with oranges. And then if I want to add a little wee bit of orange up in here, and then also I could add a ton of water to that. And so if I want a very unique watercolor pattern within my leaves, then I could add a little bit of opacity, but a lot of water, and let the water carry out the paint and create very unique shapes within that, but then I will still have my leaf pattern from underneath. Now, if it carries the paint away and starts to make it lighter, then that's going to erase my original leaf pattern because I'm changing the values underneath. So reason why is if I turn this layer off, that's what I have, a big white spot. Now it's starting to bleed out into it, so I have to be careful with that. If I back that up, stop it right there, and then now turn this layer back on, now that's what I have. So depending on what's going on with your layer underneath is going to come through your masked off leaves on the darker layer. So now with all that in mind, I will do the same thing with the rocks. And again, if I want to, as I said before, I could go to my boulders, and if I create a mask on them, I only have one layer of paint on these boulders. So I could change that different ways. I could put another layer of paint on top of it and work with that one, whether it be a mask or not. But then now, if just say, for example, I want to clean up this edge or make an edge on the top of this, then all I would have to do, I could use this one, take it way down, take the opacity up, and then go back to a more or less a much whiter color. But then if I go to a dark color, I'm going to create my edge. So in other words, go to a Prussian blue, and if I want to create the top of this boulder, I could do that just by using the Prussian blue, and I'm going to take it down to almost white. So again, if I'm taking down color too quick, then I could go back to like a cobalt blue, and I can even adjust the opacity to it. And then if I go there, now I'm leaving some color behind. If that's still too much, then what I could do is go back to my whites and re-add that color back in. It doesn't matter. It's a mask with a non-destructive effect. So now if I go back to white, I'm going to start adding that color back in. But keep in mind, I'm working on my actual mask, not the actual colors I'm using. So now if I go back in and add some of that in, and then I can even still let's see. Let's go back to. Let's go back to. We'll do that, change that, but then, like, say for example, again, when I said about these spots, then what I would do is go back to this kind of brush here. I'm gonna take the size way down, and then take the opacity up. But then if I start going back to a cobalt blue or a burnt sienna, and stay on my mask, if I start putting that down, then what I'm going to do is get a white spot pattern up against the dark background. Now, depending on what brush I use is going to depend on what effect I'll get. Then now that is going to be my spot pattern. But again, I'm getting a white spot pattern up against the dark background. So if I have, just say for example, one last look at this, and I will do this. If I have this type of a photograph, if I have just some white spots up against a pretty big dark background, then I could use the mask to make those white spots. But if I have just a little wee bit of dark spots up against a rather big white background, then I could just put down the dark spots on the painted part of that layer and just create a few dark spots, but then still even go back in with my mask and take some of them out, erase some of them, but it's not a permanent change. Let's get this painting done, and we'll talk about it at the very end. Starting off with the blueberry bush brushes, I'm trying to mix up the brushes as I go. Then I'll go back in and work with the darker colors in between the bushes themselves. If I want to add that snap of vivid yellow or green in the highlighted areas, then I would go back to the layer underneath, the masking layer. Putting in the foreground branches of the pine trees, I could then feather some of the lighter areas back into the dark colors of the middle part of the tree. Defining my edges of boulders, I really can't put too much detail in the boulders because they're fairly far away from the viewer. Adjusting the colors, putting a little wee bit more of a snap to the foreground pines, putting in my script work, and I'm just about done. Let's take a look and see what we have. Okay, here is the finished piece. What I did was I saved two different sets of layers, two different ways for two different reasons. The first time I saved some of the layers, I duplicated them over just to have backups. Once I got my deep greens and deep sepias for the closer pine trees the way I wanted to keep that as a backup. I just liked the way the watercolors were mixing, and I wanted to keep a spare. Now, the other reason why I duplicated some of the layers, that was the blueberry bush layers themselves, the darker layer and the lighter layer underneath. I duplicated both of them. So I was working with 4 layers at a time. Now, this was for two different reasons. One was it doubled over the darkness and contrast of my blueberries, which is something I wanted. But then I could fine tune how much lighter I could make them if they go too dark. But then I can also experiment with blend modes, as far as if I start experimenting with multiply or a couple of the other ones, a linear blend, then I will change things just exactly the way I want, and some things will be left alone. Now, you could fine tune that a lot of different ways, but the photographer in me likes to work with multiple layers. That's just me. But now what I can also do then is I fine-tuned some of the darker areas because I was working on 2 identical layers. Both had masks on. But if I use the mask on the top layer, even at 100% opacity, I could still only take it down technically 50% because there's still a mask and identical layer underneath it. So it gave me the opportunity to really fine-tune some of the darker areas. Instead of just leaving them bland dark, I just put some hint of a shape in them just to make them more interesting instead of having them as a dead space. Now, with all of the masks used, I'll go through this real quickly. This is all of the masks that if I start turning them off of the visible layers, then you will see what all the masks are doing to the painting itself. And once I get them all turned off, we'll take a look and see what it looks like. And then we will slowly turn them back on. Now this is what it looks like with all the masks turned off. Big difference actually. Rather bland. Just okay, but the greens, the deep greens, are a lot more noticeable now compared to without the actual masks on themselves. Now let's go ahead and turn on the mask again. The fog is very subtle. And then the sky wash, that is just the clouds. And then also the base of the cloud. And then the blueberries make the biggest difference between the light and the dark. And then also I wanted to show you one last thing here before we call it complete. And that is if I turn off my bright, vivid yellow-green layers, which are these right here, now all of a sudden I got blueberries in frost, which is kind of interesting. This kind of looks like a really frosty picture. And trust me when I tell you, a very subtle frost outline on small leaves is a very difficult pattern to paint or duplicate. But with this type of effect, it looks somewhat believable that these are plants or leaves with frost on them or a light dusting of snow. I think frost would be far more believable than snow because snow has a thickness to it before it starts to cover things up. Now, with that in mind, I will turn these back on, and hopefully this gave you some ideas just how to use a layer mask and how many different things you could do with it. But the most important concept of a mask is they're all non-destructive changes. You could leave it there, you could turn it on, turn it off. If you're sure you want it, you could apply it, but then also it gives you the opportunity to reverse your changes if you need to and refine them as much as you want without creating duplicate layers, changing things over. It's just a really interesting tool that once you start to get the hang of what they could do and how they do it, you may very well want to add it to how you paint and your subject matter. Now, as I always say, this one is pretty well concluded. Until I see you out in the field or back at the studio, thanks for watching.